It was the garbage barge that did it. Over several months in 1987, a New York barge packed with waste chugged between U.S. ports, hoping to offload its increasingly smelly cargo. Port after port refused to accept it. The barge's long and slow journey became a television saga, a symbol of a wasteful society. And together with a report that portrayed Canadians as among the worst wasters in the world, encouraged politicians to do something about waste, especially packaging waste. In true Canadian fashion, a multi-stakeholder committee was set up, plans drafted, and a national protocol proclaimed.
Packaging, of course, was a prime target at the time. Now, I remember actually at one point the Canadian government called for a conference on packaging, and it was a very negative experience. I remember for the people in the paper packaging sector, because the guy running it from Environment Canada made a very blunt comment that he was going to get us. I remember that specifically.
The need was, there was a threat, and I'm going to use that term loosely, that we could be regulated out of business.
At the time, the PAC was representing us, and they didn't voice our opinions correctly. They really did not say it correctly, and we felt we needed to be at the table in Ottawa, and that's why we went there, to make sure that our voice was being heard. It was very important. Duncan Campbell in particular, and myself, had gotten together and talked and said, we need to create an organization that is fighting this problem that was our whole industry was being faced with, which was false information was being presented. The landfill issue was a huge issue, and yet we were being blamed as the problem. Packaging was the problem, paper boxes were the problem. Look at all those paper boxes. So the paper industry said, well, wait a minute, we're part of the solution. We're not part of the problem, we're part of the solution. And so Duncan Campbell and myself made an appointment to go down to Ottawa to speak to them, to try and set the record straight. And it was from that meeting down in Ottawa that we came back and we said, we have to set the ground rules, we have to set the parameters on how we're going to address this, because people weren't listening properly. And that's how really Ron McNeil of Strathcona and myself, Rick Ellery, Dick State, a few other people said we have to organize as a active unit, the corrugated industry, the paper board industry, the folding carton industry, the paper box business. Anybody who was related in the paper industry needed to get together. And though we all had separate organizations, we didn't have one voice speaking on behalf of everybody. And that's where PPEC came to be.
A standalone entity that would be charged with carrying the project forward. We wanted it as a third party, unbiased towards our industry, one that could gain credibility. The main function of that body was to come up with facts and figures that would support what we were doing as an industry, that would give a baseline, if you will, from which we could move forward.
John Mullender was working as a freelance journalist at the time and heard about plans for PPEC through a chance conversation that two of his friends had at a game of squash.
I knew something about environmental issues, but I knew nothing about packaging. But I was intrigued enough, and I decided to put my hat in the ring. The two people who interviewed me, Duncan Campbell and Chris Woods, were key movers behind the launching of PPEC back in 1990. And so they interviewed me, and it obviously went okay because they told me to turn up for a meeting of the full PPEC board about 2 weeks later. I duly turned up and was introduced to the full board. And then, I'm sure it was Rick Ellery, said, okay, you can take the minutes now. Well, I'm still taking the minutes 25 years later. It's been quite an experience.
It was a steep learning curve. The council needed to be legally formed, create a logo, and a work plan. It lost 2 of its first chairmen to industry restructuring in the first couple of months. But fortunately, Ron McNeil, the president of Strathcona Paper, stepped up, and he was a steadying influence in the early years.